Hello. I am talking through the Danish missions pack. I have reached sectors. Sectors is a funny one. What you do is you divide the table into quarters and you roll off, and then the person who wins gets to decide which quarter they want. And then the opposition gets to have the diagonal corner. So the deployment, where you deploy and how you deploy contrary to your enemy is kind of weird, right? Especially weird because the enemy's reinforcements will still come in along their edge. So he can basically outflank you, and you can basically outflank him. Now, you score points for having destroyed units or for being placing units in a neutral sector or in the enemy's deployment zone. One for being in a neutral sector, and you have to be more than 50% in the sector. So if you have a tank, you can't just like have one wheel in that sector. You have to have more than 50% of the unit. If that is an infantry unit, then more than 50% of the models need to be in that sector. This is really interesting because it's the only one where you basically you score a point for the place that you are at, and you can basically win without killing anything of the opponents. There is a bit of this in envelopment and in double envelopment, but it definitely feels different in this scenario, a lot different. You don't have to be very mobile in this scenario, although it does help to be somewhat mobile. In envelopment and double envelopment, armies that are very mobile, that have a lot of trucks, that have a lot of wheeled vehicles or track vehicles, they have a real advantage. But in this scenario, that's not really needed. In this scenario, armies that have a lot of order dice, however, have a real advantage. Because all you have to do, if you outnumber the opponent in order dice, all you have to do is move all of your stuff into a neutral zone and prevent him from taking your deployment zone. Then you win by simple numbers, right? You don't have to kill stuff, you can just move it. And my first advice for when you're playing this scenario is think carefully about the deployment zones. Pick a zone that you can defend from whatever's coming from the opponent's quarter, his neutral quarter, because that is where his reserves are going to come in. Typically, those reserves are going to be tanks and trucks loaded up with nastiness, and that's because this scenario has preparatory bombardment. So everything that's in your deployment zone will get hit by preparatory bombardment. Most people will only deploy infantry because that is less vulnerable. Yes, it might lose one dude, but it will not get completely destroyed. Small teams are vulnerable, single men are vulnerable, and vehicles are vulnerable to preparatory bombardment. So that is typically what you will see set aside for the reserves. There's no outflank. So you pretty much know where his reserves are going to come, which means that you can also deploy your answer to them, expecting him to come at that point. Another critical point on the battlefield in this scenario is the center of the table is pretty critical. You're not deploying within 12 of the center, but that is still just 2 movements, and then you are inside. Two movements. Because it still counts as the whole sector, even though you can't deploy in it. So if you want to move into the opponent's home sector, his deployment zone, and conquer that, you can move across the middle. Which means that some armies, especially armies with veterans, will try to push through the middle into the enemy's deployment zone and win by being more men, having more units in the enemy's deployment zone than he can scrape up of points. And each unit in that deployment zone is a 3-point score. So that's a lot of points. one more thing that I would suggest. I would suggest that you have everything in your own deployment zone so that it can move out of your deployment zone. You might need that point. So a lot of people will bury their artillery way in the back of their deployment zone. That's how you usually deploy artillery, right? You deploy it as far away from the enemy as possible so that it can shoot out, cause damage, and be artillery, basically. But in this scenario, you might need that one point. And if it's buried deep in your deployment zone, it will not be able to reach the edge. So I would suggest placing your artillery either up along the center line where your deployment zone ends and his neutral zone begins, or right next to your own neutral zone, which is my favorite place to place artillery, like 5 inches from that edge, so that with a single run move you can move your artillery out of your zone. This, of course, is if you can move that artillery. There are some artillery pieces that you can't, right? But if you can, that is a good idea. Yeah. When you're placing your forward deployers, I would also suggest placing them outside in your neutral zone. That's the only place they can go, by the way. They can go in your deployment zone, but most often if you have forward deployers, they are spotters, they are artillery observers, they're very small units, or most of the time they're even like team units or whatever. So 1 or 2 men. They are in horrible danger in your own deployment zone because there will be preparatory bombardment, and you're not able to push them across into the opponent's half of the table, his neutral zone, but you can deploy them in your own neutral zone. So do that, and of course try to figure out where they have the line of sight and all of whatever they need, right? But I would suggest placing them in your neutral zone because then they are points. You've already scored points, which is good in this scenario. Final thing that I would like you to think about is, again, we have a scenario from the rulebook where kill points is a thing. You can play this scenario as a strict kill point mission where you just start killing the opponent. And this is where, again, yes, horde armies that have a lot of order dice have an advantage here, but they also have a slight disadvantage. And that is, if you play this as simply a kill point mission, most horde armies will have trouble because they have so many kill points to lose, and quite often their units are not very strong because they've instead spent point on many units, right, instead of beefing out single units. So if you're facing an enemy that has a horde, I would suggest trying to play this as a kill point mission. You can win by doing that. Yeah. Those were my suggestions and my tactical tutorial for how to play sectors. Anything left I want to say? Yes. You have to deploy 50% of your units on the table, so think very carefully about what you're setting there because of that preparatory bombardment. Final advice. Cheers.